So I think we're on week 8 of loving our neighbour. How do I love my neighbour? Got a video for you that's going to come up in a moment, just to give you some context to the video. It's actually a video that Joseph was going to use in the course yesterday until we were having a bit of a chat beforehand. I said, I'm going to show this video, and he went, oh, okay, well, I won't. And so he didn't show it yesterday. He let me have that joy and privilege. It's animated, so, it should absorb you, draw you in, draw you in. It's going to talk about the difference between empathy and sympathy. Just so that, we'll talk a bit more about it as it comes out of it. It's by Brené Brown, she's very research-based and oriented. She probably came to note through doing research on shame. She's endeavoured to measure stuff that often we would traditionally think was pretty hard to measure. She's very cluey like that, and so she looked and researched and measured things like shame, but also she's looked at things like empathy and the power of empathy. So this sets up the difference between empathy and sympathy, which I just want us to think about this morning a little bit as we think about what it is to be an unofficial neighbourhood chaplain with our neighbours, with those who God puts in front of us. It's fairly dismissive of sympathy, but we'll have a bit more of a talk about that in a moment. But in the meantime, let's have a look. And I love the start.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here. And you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
So I got to practice that this morning after 8:30, where I tried to talk, and then that sort of came in, so I knew just to stop and wait. So that's the difference between sympathy and empathy. To put it maybe a little bit more in a nutshell, as I was talking to Joseph, he described it as this. Sympathy is where we are in our own frame, our own understanding of things. And so for me, as a Wallaby supporter going through some degree of grief this morning, if you're a Wallaby supporter, then I can have sympathy with you quite easily, because I know what it's like to be a Wallaby supporter. If you're a South African supporter this morning, you you having sympathy with me is very, very hard, isn't it? It's a different world for you. Empathy, though, is where, even though we may not have experienced it, we're still able to somehow come alongside. And did you notice how the big bear, instead of eating the antelope, the big bear, the little antelope, had a cloud, a rain cloud, this thing that they were experiencing. And the bear was able to sort of take that on themselves somehow, even though it wasn't their experience. And so it's interesting what is helpful. The bear in the end says, well, I don't really know what to say, but I'm so glad you told me. In other words, I'm glad we're here, I'm glad we're together, I'm glad we're connected about this, but doesn't endeavour to silver line it, at least. And there's that line, isn't there, your marriage is falling apart, but at least you've got a marriage. And then there's the eye roll. It's like, yeah, that was a silly thing to say. That doesn't actually help trying to silver line things. It's rather just being with. Why are we looking at this tomorrow and thinking about this? Well, just for a moment, just to anchor this into where it lands with our vision statement, I guess, and that idea of going from left to right, that we are a community that is founded on God's love, and that impacts us as individuals as we're formed and shaped and find our identity in Christ. That shapes us as a community, and then coming to the final icon there, that idea that we're then a community of love that walks alongside others. That is the space we're sitting in just for a little while this morning, is that fourth icon, the one on the very right, of what it is to walk alongside other people that God places in our path. Now remember the definition of neighbour. A neighbour is somebody who is simply near. And so we're talking about walking with somebody who just happens to be nearby. This morning in particular, as I said, we're looking at that idea of being a local, unofficial neighbourhood chaplain. And last week we looked, just to put this into a context, last week we looked at intercessory prayer, interceding in prayer for others. And so where other people are hurting or going through a hard time, we looked at that idea of stepping into the gap and representing them before God, coming to God with their needs. That's what interceding is. Intercessory prayer is a part of chaplaincy, I think. But just for a moment, just thinking of that was all that we looked at last week. Today, as we think of chaplaincy, that is one element of something that can come under chaplaincy. Of course, you don't have to be a chaplain to do it. But it might be one thing that a chaplain would do. We're going to look at it a little bit more broadly this morning. If you're wondering where the word chaplain came from, I can't tell you if this is true, because all I know is that it came from the internet. But I have read it in a number of places as to where the word chaplain came from. The word chapel, or that is where chaplain comes from, means little cloak. So why is little cloak? How did that become chaplain? Well, it all came from Saint Martin of Tours, who should have been a rock star because he was always on tour. But St. Martin of Tours, while serving Rome as a soldier deployed in Gaul, that's right, with Asterix and Obelix and people like that, cut his military coat in half to share with a ragged beggar. That night, Martin dreamed Christ wearing the half cloak. Actually sort of connects in with our Bible reading in a couple of ways. But that idea that somebody was naked, he had a cloak, and so that he could still have a cloak, but a smaller one, but this naked person, this beggar, could also have a cloak, he cut his cloak in half. That's where that sort of comes from. And then there was a relic, which was supposed to be his half of the cloak, was kept as a relic. So I don't know if you know much about early church history, but they loved relics. There was at least 5 skulls of John the Baptist that were floating around in different places, kept as relics. But one of the holy relics way back was the half a cloak from St. Martin of Tours. And that was housed in a place that was called the chapel, the place where the little cloak lives. And so that's where the idea of chaplaincy sprung from, apparently. How true? Not sure. It's interesting, though, and this came straight from, I guess, it's a website, I don't know how to say it, Etym online, where they look at the etymology of words, where words have come from. And it highlights that night, after doing this, Martin dreamed Christ wearing the half cloak, which sort of brings us to our reading a little bit, doesn't it? That idea that, I was naked and you clothed me. And Jesus says, if you did it to them, you did it to me. And so just as we think about that, and as we come to the passage this morning, we're not going to look at all of this passage. I do want to highlight one thing. This is not a parable. Often the sheep and the goats is referred to as a parable. It's not a parable. A parable is where Jesus would have said something like, well, there was a master or there was a king. He actually makes it really clear that he is the king. He says when the Son of Man comes, he's referring to himself. It's not a parable. It uses, I guess, analogy with sheep and goats, but it's quite clear that Jesus is referring to people who are like sheep and goats that a farmer divides or separates or sorts. So in verses 35 to 36, there's this bit where Jesus highlights to the sheep what it is that they've done. He says, for I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes, you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me. Now, I don't know if you know much about chaplaincy, but that actually describes a lot of places where we actually have, where we employ, where we commission chaplains to go. We actually send them to places where people are in need. One of the ones that is typically a place where we would send chaplains to these days is prison, which is mentioned there explicitly, isn't it? Places where people are struggling and possibly overwhelmed with things that are happening is where we send chaplains. I don't know if you remember when Joseph came and he spoke about chaplaincy to you a couple of years ago. He highlighted that chaplains are people who are invited in to places, places where other people can't necessarily just come into. They're trained and qualified so that they can be of help in that space that they're invited into. And Jesus, for a moment, just sort of perhaps helps us just to shift our thinking that this is something that Jesus is saying, well, it's great to have chaplains maybe. Well, actually, maybe Jesus isn't saying this, I'm saying this. Maybe it's great to have chaplains, paid professionals, qualified, trained in these places. But Jesus is also saying is you can't actually commercialize that and ship that out in all areas of your life. There's actually some places where you are who I'm calling to be a chaplain to someone. It's you that I want to be the person who's going to feed somebody, or to invite somebody in, or to clothe somebody, or to visit somebody. And life is also one of those things where there may be seasons where we are actually somebody who needs somebody to come alongside us. And so chaplaincy, and I don't know if you noticed it with the Brené Brown animation, but she actually refers to a sacred space in that. There's the opportunity of a connection, helping somebody else have a connection to the sacred. Now, when we talked about intercessory prayer last week, we talked about minding the gap. And there's this space which we step into in intercessory prayer, where we represent somebody else before God. And in a way, that's sort of continuing on for us this morning, except instead of like just a gap, the way Brené Brown has pictured it for us is it's a hole that somebody's in, and we are going down to be where they are at their level. And somehow there's a sacredness, or in a way, maybe an opportunity to connect somebody to the sacred or the transcendent or the divine, if you like, to God. But it involves getting down into the hole where they are, into their situation, which was the difference between sympathy and empathy, wasn't it? Empathy is where you actually do come down and you sit with them. You don't just stay conveniently out of the situation and offer them a sandwich, though a sandwich may be helpful, but rather you come down. And as I was talking to Joseph, and Joseph was explaining the difference between sympathy and empathy, he said, sympathy, because it's within the framework that you've already experienced. There's an easiness. He said sympathy, and this wasn't so much in the video, but sympathy can still be helpful. It has a place. But it's just easier because of our own experience. Empathy requires work and an effort and an intentionality to enter into what the other person is more. And that actually creates an opportunity and something that's quite special. So one of the things I was thinking, and I referred to this book a few weeks ago, I don't know if you remember, How to Talk About Jesus Without Being That Guy by Sam Chan. And he actually has a whole chapter in this book about chaplaincy. It's called Become Their Unofficial De Facto Chaplain. And in this, he sort of highlights, if you want, I don't want to cheapen it or simplify it too much, a strategy as to how it is that you can be a chaplain. But it sort of involves a reality that is just there. And that's that reality, if you've read the beginning of Genesis, that you would have some idea of. In the beginning of Genesis, it makes it clear, doesn't it, that everything gets broken. The world becomes a place that is fallen, where there is pain, where there is death, where there is grief, where there is heartache. Those things enter into God's perfect creation. And so as a result, those are things that do happen in our lives, don't they? And so part of the strategy that Sam Chan talks about is this idea that this is going to happen to other people. Now, I found a picture of Eeyore with his own rain cloud, which I thought was cool. But I just want to say, there's a part of me I just want to acknowledge in Sam Chan's strategy. This isn't about waiting and hoping and praying for calamity to strike your neighbour so you can then step in or step down into their hole. It's actually just acknowledging the reality that if you're close to somebody and near somebody, there will come a time. In fact, it's going to probably come for you at some time as well, isn't it? It's a part of living in this world that we have people we love who then leave us, whether it's through death, whether it's through a relationship breakdown, whatever it might be. And so what Sam Chan encourages us to think about is this pre-calamity presence that we can be. As we're not necessarily praying for or waiting for something to happen bad to happen to our neighbours, but just the reality that maybe we have neighbours and there isn't anything bad, that we can be being intentional in that space. Because there will be, or there may well be, a time where there'll be an opportunity for us to enter into some pain with them in the form of empathy. Now, I just also want to acknowledge the fact that sometimes you don't get this opportunity for this pre-calamity period of being an intentional presence. I remember I was with a friend of mine who used to drive a V8 Commodore back in the day. He reminds me of Andy. I don't know why, because Andy drives Fords. But anyway, and we were driving out of the city and we were around Newtown Way, and there was a pedestrian crossing, and the sun was setting just behind the pedestrian crossing, and there was a lady walking across the pedestrian crossing, and there was a car in front of us. And because of the place of the sun, the guy in the car in front of us could not see this woman who, I don't think you could even see that it was a pedestrian crossing. And so he just drove straight into this woman as she was walking across. She went over the bonnet of the car and miraculously for us seemed to just bounce back up and continue walking. But, there's everything in us was saying, no, there's something terribly wrong here. And so my friend in his V8, he said, get out, see if she's all right. And he was going to stay in the car and he was going to do a pursuit of the guy if the guy decided to make a run for it, but he didn't. But I remember sitting with that woman, and so there's no intentional pre-calamity time. This is the first time I've met this woman, and we're suddenly in this situation where she's just been hit by a car. And it was interesting because she was probably the least anxious presence there. The rest of us were pretty anxious. She was, at that point was not anxious because I think she was still in shock. She hadn't realised what had happened. But there was no opportunity to develop a relationship in a calm, peaceful time before that. It was just, who am I right now in the midst of this as somebody is in this situation? So pre-calamity presence doesn't always happen. But very briefly, very practically, I hope, Sam Chan gives us some things to think about. First of all, he says that if you'd like to be an intentional neighbour with your neighbours, people around you, then the first thing is to take an interest in this pre-calamity period. You've got an opportunity to do this right now if you're not. Now, some of you with your neighbours, probably already doing these things. We've already talked about it in previous weeks, learn their names, but it gets a bit more investment requiring as we go on. Be available, make time, be approachable, allow margin. All those things are quite thoughtful and intentional, because all of those things, even though there's no calamity, there's no issues that need to be talked about or anything, they all set up the scenario, the opportunity, if something does happen, for your neighbour to come to you. One of the realities is that some of us are not approachable at the best of times, which means when something bad happens, people don't go, well, I'll go see them. They actually go, well, no, I won't. And it's a really interesting thing in my job. Ministers, even though we only work 1 day a week, are often seen as really busy. And so people sometimes come to me with massive things, and they come apologetically. They come with this, I'm sorry, I know you're busy. And it's like, no, this is what I do. It says to me, maybe I'm not modelling that I have some time, that I am approachable, that I have some margin for these things, because this is life. And so it actually involves us having that space and that time with our neighbours, and we may have to be the ones who generate that and create that, so that when something does happen, then we're there. Now, one of the things that Tim said about loving our neighbours was how this is something that if we're going to try and do it in our own strength is very difficult. It's something that we need to rely on God for, being shaped by Him, so that what He is doing in us flows out from us. And so it's not just that we take an interest, though these things will be easier with God's help, but it's actually who we then are in this space that we have created that's really important. Does that make sense? Who we are in this space. It's one thing to be approachable and have the time, but it's then how helpful we are and what it is that we are able to bring as God is working in us and through us. And so Sam Chan raises some other things in that space. The importance of us being less anxious. Now just think about it for a moment. I'm sure we can all picture somebody, and maybe for a moment you may actually see yourself. But we might be able to picture somebody we know who at the best of times has a level of anxiety going on. Now just think about it. In a situation where there's a bit of a calamity, there's a bit of a disaster happening, or there's a bit of stress, is that the person that you would want to go to? Noting that their anxiety is probably going to be heightened in that situation. And so one of the things, and this is a very easy thing to say, but it's something that requires some shaping and forming in us and some help from God in us, is to be a less anxious person. But that's all of the time, or as much as we can. Remember, I'm not saying to be a non-anxious, because that's pretty much impossible, but to be less anxious. A less anxious person is a person who trusts God in the little things that are happening, as well as the big things. I've got there, releases what is not theirs. A less anxious presence is somebody who sort of understands that some things are out of their pay grade or not their responsibility. One of the things about chronic anxiety is that we're often concerned about the things that we have no control or power over. The less anxious person is the person who just goes, well, I'm not going to worry about that chain of events that I've just been thinking about that could happen. I'm just going to worry about actually what does happen and as it unfolds. To be differentiated in that space, that is to be somebody who is able to be themselves and hold on to their values and beliefs and remain connected with other people, even if their beliefs and their values are different, perhaps. And to be modelling an intentional life of substance. That's an easy thing to say. It's a very different thing to try and do, isn't it? To model an intentional life of substance. But this is where Sam goes. He actually talks a little bit about wisdom in this chapter on chaplaincy. And the idea that wisdom is, especially from the Bible, that understanding that it's a way of life as God has designed it to be. And one of the things that Sam Chan highlights is that sometimes he's had neighbours say to him, you know, what is it with you Christians? You seem to have an extra dose of wisdom as to how to live life. And that's not something that we automatically fall into. That's something that comes about through walking with Jesus through life. So modelling an intentional life of substance, so that you're somebody who your neighbour looks at and sees and goes, they've got something anchoring their life in a way that when storms come and go, they don't get swept around. There's something substantial going on in them that anchors them. See, what happens is if you're that person in somebody's life and life suddenly becomes a little bit anchorless for them, without an anchor, then they look to you and they think of you. And so, yes, this is a strategy that Sam Chan has come up with. It makes a lot of sense for me, but it's also something that surely should turn us back to God, to be shaped and formed by Him to help us to do this. Sam talks about a few other things. One of the things that he mentions about chaplaincy is to offer to pray, give your friends permission to talk about how things are, really. Show them you understand. This is where empathy is very helpful. Acknowledge and affirm their feelings, offer to pray, and then follow up on the next time you see them. He goes through some simple techniques as to how it is that we can encourage people to share more with us. He talks about that things that psychologists do where they ask you, how are you this morning? And you answer and they go, and how are you really? That sort of thing. He says just gently giving them prompts to encourage them to know that if they would like to, you are somebody who is able to handle a deeper conversation with them. Once again, in times of calamity, it's great for them to know if there's somebody who can handle a deeper conversation. And this, of course, if you can link it in with prayer, as we looked at last week, is helpful. And in all of this, to be Jesus, to be that connection to the sacred. Jesus is amazing, isn't he? The way that he gives his own life so freely for us. The very fact that the creator of the universe comes down and dies on a cross for us says something, especially when we think about how he calls us, but to be us and be like him as well. To be people who are willing to come down. I was thinking about this, and there's these 2 chapters in John's Gospel where Jesus plays in the dirt. And just, for your own mental health, it's good to play in the dirt sometimes. The first one, you might remember it. It's that time in John chapter 8 where there's a woman who's caught in adultery who's brought before Jesus. And what does Jesus do? It says that he kneels down and he starts playing in the dirt. He's writing something. There's a lot of guesses as to what it is that he was writing or doing. And in that, somehow he makes this connection with this woman, which somehow accepts her where she is at, while still encouraging her to be the best that she can be. And then we jump over to John chapter 9, and Jesus plays in the dirt again. I'm sorry, this is new to me. I only put it together recently that in 2 chapters in a row, Jesus plays in the dirt. And for that one, there's a blind guy. And we're told that he's begging. He's sitting by the side of the road. And so he's down, if you know what I mean, down there in the dirt himself. And Jesus comes along, and we're told that what Jesus does is that he then gets down into the dirt as well, which I think is really important. He does it for a really weird reason. Do you remember? He gets down and he spits in the dirt, and he makes mud in the dirt. He has a good play, gets his hands dirty, and then he puts it on the blind person's eyes. But to do all that, he had to get down to where the blind person was. Have you ever thought about that? And you might say, well, he's a blind person. He wouldn't have known where Jesus was. But he would have, because blind people do. They hear. They know where people are. They sense the presence of somebody. And they would have known, this guy Jesus, who I'm pretty sure is the only guy I've heard of who can heal me, is now in the dirt next to me. There's something powerful in that. I'm sorry, this talk, it feels like it's a little bit all over the place as I try and pull some of these things together. But I hope there's some things that are helpful and practical. I do want to come back to Sam Chan, who makes this comment, and this is his strategy, I guess, that he wants to suggest, and I'm not asking anybody to pray for calamity to hit their neighbours, but he says, sooner or later your friend will have a crisis. That's reality. And he says they will come to you, and notice this, he says, expecting you to speak on behalf of God. The reason he says that is because in the context of the chapter, he's made it really clear that you and I should be people who are transparent with our neighbours about who we are. In other words, they're coming to you expecting you to speak on behalf of God because they know that you are somebody who says they follow God. And so they come to you expecting you to speak on behalf of God. They'll ask you to provide meaning and clarity. And by coming to you, they are hoping, and here we have it again, to connect to the transcendent. Something that is different, something special, something outside of themselves that is able to be an anchor for them in this situation. Well, maybe to bring all this together, it's helpful to come back to this story that Jesus tells. He's got the sheep on one side. He said, you fed me. You gave me something to drink. You saw me as a stranger. You invited me in. I needed clothes. You clothed me. When I was sick, when I was in prison, you came and visited me. And this is the response of the sheep. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? Now, you might, like I always looked at it and I thought, well, that's because, they did it to somebody else. And now Jesus is saying, well, you did it to me. And they know, well, we didn't do it to you, Jesus. We did it to this other person. And yeah, I guess that's a part of it. There's also something else that's just beautiful about it. It's like this reality that they just didn't know what they were doing. In the sense that, I think, it's because of what God was doing within them that flowed out from them. There's a sense in which it was new to them, that they had been somehow helpful to somebody else in this way. And that it had an impact that went beyond what they thought they were doing. And so in verse 40, the king replies, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. So I encourage you this morning, be Jesus, be a connection to the sacred for others. And just to remember Brené Brown's final words in that video we watched. Rarely can a response make something better. Rarely can a response make something better. It can at times, but rarely. And just think for a moment, when somebody is going through something really hard and there's a silence and you're there, and you figure it's up to you to open your mouth and say something, how much pressure do you feel? I feel a lot, don't you? Like I always have this temptation to think what I say next is going to make this or it's going to break this. It's going to be helpful or it's going to be harmful. But the whole thing that Brené Brown was trying to encourage us to think about was the most important thing is actually not what you say at this next point. Remove that pressure. It's actually whether or not you'll be there. We sometimes undervalue the reality of presence. How important it is just to be there. So rarely can a response make something better. More often, what makes something better is a connection. And so whatever happens for you this week with your neighbour, I guess the encouragement is for you to be there, to make a connection in some way. Because all of this leads us to this image that we like to use at the Lord's Supper. This idea of fellowship, of connection, of sitting at a table together, of sharing what we have, of being family. This happens so that when hard times come, we're there for each other. But it also happens because during hard times, we're there for each other. And so I want to pray for you this week with whoever it is that God places before you, that you may be helpful to them. I also recognize again that maybe you're in a season where you're actually really hoping and longing for somebody to come alongside you, in which case I will pray for that as well. Let's pray. Yeah, we thank you, Heavenly Father, for your love for us. We thank you that you were there for us. We ask, Heavenly Father, that you would help us to be there for one another. Lord, help us to be able to empathize. Lord, help us to be intentional in good times, that we might be helpful in hard times. And Lord, I just recognize for some of us here this morning, hard times are here. Maybe it's been helpful, or maybe it's been hard to listen to a talk like this morning. I pray, Lord, that you would meet those needs as well. Lord, help us to walk life with each other and with you. In Jesus' name, amen.